The story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, as recorded in the Gospels, has probably been one of the most scrutinized, analyzed, and attempted to be debunked stories in all of human history. Over and over again, skeptics and others have tried to look at these accounts and see if they could poke holes into finding out whether these gospel accounts were made up, whether they were simply grown fables over time, or were they really recorded events as the eyewitnesses seem to testify? Hi everyone, I'm Lenny Esposito, and on this Come Let Us Reason, I'd like to take a different tack in approaching the question of the reliability of the Gospels. We're going to look at a couple of what I call hidden ways the Gospels prove reliable, ways that aren't usually discussed or examined, but ways that actually have a high value in proving that these gospel accounts are history, something that forgers really would never think to employ, and something that fable just simply couldn't support. It's an intriguing study, one I've given before, but one that I've not done on this podcast in quite a while. So here is the hidden ways the Gospels prove reliable on this Come Let Us Reason Together.
Author, speaker, and debater. I love that part. Lenny Esposito has been spreading convincing Christianity across the globe by stirring the hearts and minds of the lost and the church for over 20 years. A pioneer. I didn't know pioneers for just 20 years. 20 years is not much time. A pioneer in online apologetics, and his popular, get this, comereason.org. Comereason.org. Check him out. His website and podcast. Lenny has also contributed to books such as the award-winning Apologetic Study Bible for Students, A New Kind of Apologist with Harvest House, and True Reason, Confronting the Irrationality of the New Atheism. And his articles have appeared in the LA Times, Southern California Christian Times, and just having dinner with him tonight, he is personable. He's also a musician. We get along well. So please welcome our guest tonight, Lenny Esposito.
Thank you so much, Chuck. Chuck has to be nice to me because I'm a bass player, and we're so hard to find. I don't know how many of you are musicians, but if we get off on music jokes, it's like, what do you call a guitar player who just broke up with his girlfriend? Homeless. That's right. How can you tell when there's a guitar player at your door? Domino's Pizza Hut. How can you tell when there's a drummer at your door? Knocking speeds up. So these kinds of things, yeah. Okay, well, welcome everyone. I am so glad to be here again. This is always a joy to come out, and I'm really excited to present this topic. This is an interesting topic, an interesting talk, because of course, a lot of people have questions about how the gospel accounts stack up. Why can we know them as something that's reliable, that's faithful, that's historical? Now, there's been a lot of ground covered in this area, but what I want to do tonight is I'm going to tease out maybe some things you've not heard before, but that you might actually be a little bit impressed or at least taken aback by. So that's the QR code that you can go to. You can follow me on any of the social channels. I'd love to keep you informed of all of the different aspects of the ministry, where we're going, what we're talking about, and some exciting projects coming up as well. Okay. When we open the Gospel of Luke, Luke starts off with a very interesting description. As he's prefacing his gospel to his friend Theophilus, he says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile the account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you've been taught. So Theophilus, the name means lover of God, is a Christian who's been taught some things. And Luke is saying, look, I went from the beginning and made a careful examination. I went to eyewitnesses and servants of the word, and I investigated them. And I wanted to write them out so you may know the exact truth of what you believe. Isn't that what we want to know? Now, most Christians would say, of course, that makes sense. But there are those who would hold that the gospel accounts are not recounting eyewitness testimony. They're something else. Bart Ehrman, who is a New Testament scholar at the University of Chapel Hill in North Carolina, he writes this: many of the books of the New Testament were written by people who lied about their identity, claiming to be a famous apostle, Peter, Paul, or James, knowing full well they were someone else. In modern parlance, that is a lie, and a book written by someone who lies about his identity is a forgery. Are we believing forgeries? In this understanding of the Gospels, how we sort them, it seems to me that they can be one of three things. They can either be forgery, they can be fable, or they can be fact. But how do we understand it? How do we discern what's forgery, what's fable, what's fact? And is there a way that we can check the data that we have? Now, the first thing that most people who are skeptical about the gospel accounts do is they say, well, how can you believe these things since they were passed down over and over and over, right? Okay, here's a Bible quiz. First of all, how many times has the Bible that is sitting in your lap right now been translated? Anybody have any ideas? How many? Take a guess. Somebody be brave. 10,000. Any other ideas? Once. The Bible in your lap has been translated from the original languages one time, from those original languages to your current version. Now, they have to do that again when language changes, but they always go back to the original languages, the original manuscripts, and they translate them. So there's nothing lost in the translation per se. Everybody can check that. It's easy. But what about before they were written down? What about that time? Because they weren't written down when Jesus was alive. It was some 30 to 50 years later that the gospel accounts were written down. Isn't that maybe where the mistakes happen? See, a lot of people will hold to this, that the gospel is like the game of telephone, right? And we've all done this at parties, where you take this sentence, and it's usually a fairly long, specific sentence, and you whisper it in the ear of an individual, and they have to whisper it to the next one and the next one. And by the time it gets around to the end of the chain, the person who writes the sentence down and reads it, it sounds completely different from what was started, right? And everybody laughs, and they think that that's amazing how that came about. But realize that gospel transmission and the accounts as they were spoken orally and transmitted to those who ultimately wrote them down, like Luke, it wasn't like telephone at all. For the telephone game is by its design meant to be confusing. You have a long sentence, you hear it once, you only tell one person, and then they have to, by memory, tell it to another person. And usually the sentence has no bearing or meaning on your life. However, the oral accounts of the Gospels are a lot more like what I used to do in school, which is wrestling. And in wrestling, you have to use certain moves. You have to learn certain techniques. This is true of judo or any of the martial arts, right? There are certain ways that you go about understanding and learning how to execute these moves properly in order to defend yourself. And what do? You sit under a coach and he says, do it again. Do it again. Get it right. And he watches and he makes sure that you get it right. So in the oral transmission of the ancient world, be it Homer's Iliad or the gospel accounts, when the disciples were learning, they would have to learn from the apostles the right way. And the apostles would correct them. Do it again. Learn it right. Memorize it the way I told you. Matter of fact, we see several times, take the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, where Jesus gives kind of the same sermon more than once. That's so people can remember it. So it's not gospel transmission that's a problem. Matter of fact, Richard Bauckham, who is a New Testament scholar, says something very clear. He says, we need to recover the sense in which the Gospels are testimony. This does not mean that they are testimony rather than history. No. It means that they are a certain kind of historiography. That is, they are testimony. And this is what Luke is claiming in the very beginning of his Gospel, that he interviews eyewitnesses, that he wants to capture the exact truth. Now, why should we think that this is eyewitness testimony? I mean, fable didn't creep in accidentally, and I've kind of alluded to that. I can go into more detail in the Q&A if you want. But what I want to do is I want to target Bart Ehrman and his charge of forgery, because forgery is a very specific thing. And if people are making these accounts up specifically and willfully, then that should concern us because we're believing these kinds of things. So how do we test for testimony versus forgery? Well, there's a couple of ways we can do it. And one of the ways I'm going to talk about tonight is very, very new. And it really didn't come into being until we had massive computers that could chop through a whole lot of data. The other way I'm going to talk about is actually fairly old and was first published in a book in the mid-1800s, but a lot of people don't talk about it. So let's take the first one first. Were the Gospels eyewitness testimony? Well, let's start with where they were written. Now, the conservative understanding of the four Gospels would hold to this idea. They were all written in a language called Koine Greek, which was the primary language that the commoners, people around the world, spoke. You would speak your native language. You might speak a little Latin for some Romans, but everybody spoke Koine Greek. It was the language of commerce. It was the language of business. It was how you got things done, much like English is today across the world. We recognize that all of the Gospels were probably written in the first century. So Jesus dies about 30 AD. Within the next 60 years or so, we understand all four of the Gospels are written. Some guys fudge a little bit on that, but ever since the Gospel of John Ryland's papyrus was found, most scholars hold that was the last of the four to be found, to be written. That if the Gospel of John was written somewhere around AD 100, the other three had to be written prior to that. Okay? So, the conservative scholars would hold that Matthew probably wrote his gospel in Judea. And Mark wrote his when he was accompanying Simon Peter. He was Simon Peter's secretary in Rome. Luke was somewhere in Antioch or Achaia when he put down his gospel accounts. And John was finishing out his ministry in Ephesus, Turkey, somewhere in that Asia Minor is what you would call it that back then. That's what conservative scholars believe. Now, scholars like who have a more liberal bent, they don't believe that. They believe that Matthew was probably written in Syria because they believe that this all happened after Jerusalem fell by the Romans in AD 70, right? So they think Matthew and Mark were probably both written in Syria. Luke was written in Rome. And John was probably Palestine, Syria, Asia Minor, something like that. However, Ehrman, He holds to something completely different. He thinks that they were all written outside Palestine. They never were part of Judea proper. Now, why does this matter, where they were written? Because it comes very much into play where you are and how you understand the local culture, customs, and conventions will be reflected in your writing. And what I want to look at is names tonight in the Gospels. Now, remembering names is tough. How many of you have trouble remembering names? You meet somebody at a party, and then you want to go home and talk to your spouse about that guy or that girl. What was his name? Oh, I saw him today. What was his name? Why isn't remembering names tough? My wife makes fun of me because usually I'll get the first letter right. Sally, Susie, Samantha. You mean Shelley? Yeah, that was her. And it's become almost a challenge for her now. She has to figure out who I'm talking about. And it's like a crossword puzzle. She goes, I'll get it. But why is remembering names tough? Remembering names is tough because they really don't associate to anything, right? A Tom or a Nathaniel or Tiffany, it's just a thing. Okay, that's a name. I've heard the name before. I recognize it as a name, but there's nothing to link you to the name. That's why remembering names is tough. Well, let me tell you, if remembering names is tough, inventing names is tougher. Now, what do I mean by that? Imagine you're writing a story set in Southern California in the 1980s. And you have a bunch of 20-year-olds who are out exploring the world, what have you. This is what your story is set on. Okay, so we're in 2025. You're writing a story about 1980 California. Okay, so that's kind of about the same distance that we're talking about that the skeptical authors believe the gospel accounts are from the events that they portray. What names do you use of your main characters? Well, you would have to use names that were popular in Southern California, weren't you? You don't get a lot of 20-year-old Marthas and Beatrices playing on the beach in 1980 Southern California. But if you looked up the names of, say, 1980 California and used those from the census data, well, you'd have a problem. Why is that? Because the names that were popular in 1980 were infant babies. You would have to name people names that were popular in 1960 when they came to age, right? Remember, matter of fact, in the 80s, you knew what happened in the 60s. Everybody started naming their kids Jays. Jennifer, Jason, Justin. There's a whole group of Gen Xers who have the J name. And then we went into the Tiffany and Brittany, and we moved into that. What's interesting here, though, is, and I'm talking about this lady, this is Tal Ilian. And Tal Ilian is a Jewish scholar who, what she did was, she looked at the names of all of the Jewish people that she could find in Palestine from, say, 200 BC to 70 AD. And she used 4 sources, and you see them behind me. She used the Gospels, she used the New Testament. That was one of her sources because it fit that time frame. She used Josephus as a primary source because Josephus wrote a lot of history, and he had names listed in there. And then she used ossuaries, or what they call bone boxes. This is how people were buried, and you would write the name on the side. By far, this is the biggest collection that she got these names from, were from these bone boxes. And then she used the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay? So she was able to take all of these names, every name that she could find that was written in the area of Palestine between, say, 200 BC or so, and put them all into a supercomputer and start to calculate what were the most popular names and how often were they used? Now, let me give you a comparative so that we know where we're talking about. In 2010, these were the most popular names according to the U.S. Census Bureau. So people who are naming their children born in 2010 were this. You see Jacob, the J's. Jacob and Jaden are still up there, right? Isabella, Sophia, Emma, Olivia. And you can see 1% of all kids were named Jacob, Ethan. Michael, 0.84. Good old Michael. Michael is a stalwart. That's a name that considered. Alexander, Noah. That was 2010. If you look at 1980, people who were born, look at Michael's number 1, but look who's on top for the female, Jennifer, right? Christopher, David, James. You can see the list is very different in just those 30 years. Notice number 6, and I will use number 6. Matthew and Heather. Why is Heather so popular in 1980? Anybody have any idea? Heather Locklear and Heather Thomas. As a matter of fact, there were 2 Heathers that were hitting. Yeah, it was like 1995 when Rosario became a popular name. Ross. Rachel and Ross all of a sudden became real popular in the late 90s. Go figure, okay? But that's 1980. Again, remember, if we're writing in 1980, we can't simply use these names. If we used Matthew and Heather because they're popular, you say, wait a minute, these kids are 20 years old. What happened in 1960? Well, in 1960, Matthew was okay, 61. But look at Heather. She was 298th. Nobody named their kid Heather in 1960. In 1980, they were both 6. But by 2010, Heather drops all the way out to 685. So if you're writing in 2010 about 1980 and trying to create names that were popular in 1960, you can imagine it's pretty tough to do it right. It's pretty tough to get it right. Now, if it's tough enough to get it right when you're writing about Southern California, imagine if you're writing about Paris, France in 1980. Ooh, that's even harder. Who knows what the popular French names were? Okay? Again, why do I bring this up? Because Tal Ilian, when she put all of her names into her supercomputer and generated a list, guess what she got? She got this. Now, this is male names, the top 11 that we see across the 4 different sources that I talked about: the New Testament, the books of Josephus, the ossuaries, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you'll see the number 1 most popular name was Simon or Simeon. Happened a total of 243 times. 8 times in the New Testament, 29 times in Josephus, 59 ossuaries, and 72 times in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Second is Joseph or Joses, 218 times total, 6 in the New Testament, 21 in Josephus, etc. Third is Lazarus, 166 times. Fourth is Judas, etc. And down the line. So these were the most popular. Now, in ancient Palestine, they didn't have as wide a berth. They didn't use names as broadly as we do. You would name people after your family, and you would use the same names over and over again. There was a much more limited focus. Remember when John the Baptist's father, right? You know, hey, no one's in your family named John. You can't name him that way. And he writes on the tablet, his name is John, and then his tongue is loosed. So you just didn't do that. You would use family names a lot. Why I'm bringing this up is because when you look at this list, you'll notice that the top names, which is the blue column, and the numbers on the New Testament side, they actually match up in order pretty well. Other than Lazarus, which seems to be an outlier, the top name in the New Testament is the top name that Tal Ilian found. The second name, Joseph or Joseph, is the same as Tal Ilian found. And Judas and John fit in the right spot. And Jesus and Ananias fit in the right spot. And Matthew. And she says that the New Testament actually gets them in the right order. And when you look at it even more closely, in Israel, the top 2 male names, Simon and Joseph, are found 15% across all written documents. In the New Testament, Gospels and Acts, they're 18%. That's pretty good. Top 9 male names. 41% of all men in Israel hold one of the top 9 male names. And 40% in the Gospel and Acts. That's within a good margin of error. Top 2 female names. Now, females, we don't have nearly as many recorded in the New Testament. Everybody's a Mary. Mary's like 25% of all the women mentioned in the New Testament. So we don't have as good a comparative, since we don't have a lot of female names written. But still, we see that the top 9 female names in Israel and the Gospel and Acts are still very high. How do you fake that in first century Palestine without birth records or censuses or supercomputers to look upon and draw from? Does this sound like a forgery to you? Does that make sense? Is it believable that 4 different authors writing their 4 different accounts would be so lucky as to not simply get the right top names included in the gospel, but get them in the right frequency? That's amazing. I don't know how to explain that other than what we're talking about is real world reporting. And just to underscore this, if you go outside of Palestine, if you look at Jewish communities in Egypt, for example, not that far away, southern border, what you find is the top names in Egypt don't even come close. Here they are: Eleazar, Sabbatius, Joseph, Dosithmus, Pappus, Ptolemaeus, Samuel. Why? Because most of the Jewish people outside of Palestine would reference political heroes of Israel. They would name their kids after their George Washington or their Abraham Lincoln, while those inside the country would draw from patriarchs, biblical stories, people like that. So if the gospel writers, as Bart Ehrman believes, wrote outside of Palestine, and if they are forging the Gospels, how do you explain the names? How do you explain that they get it right? Now, it's not that only the frequency of names showing up underscores their commonality. There are other clues inside the text itself. Name derivatives are important. So as I said, you have a low pool, a small pool of names. And because you have a small pool of names, you get a lot of guys who have the same name. So how do you tell the difference, right? How do you distinguish between a Simon and a Simon, as I say in the gospel accounts? If Simon's the most popular name, and we see a lot of Simons in the Bible, how do they tell the difference? Well, in the gospel accounts, you can see how they've done this. The first and the most important way is they use a variant. So Jesus' brother Joseph called Joseph, right? You call a guy by his middle name, or you JT or Junior, something like that. Zacchaeus, which is a variant of Zechariah. You kind of put a spin on his name in order to make a distinction between this guy and that guy. Another thing you see all the time is patronymic subscriptions. John, son of Zechariah. This is by far probably the most common way it was done in the ancient world. It was this guy, son of that guy, right? Simon bar Jonah, Simon, son of John. That's the Simon I'm talking about. Which Simon do you mean? Simon, son of John. Okay. Oh, I think I know who that is. By the way, when Jesus, just as an aside, this is your Bible trivia fact. When Jesus was set to be executed, who did Pilate let free instead of Jesus? And what does his name mean? Come on, you guys all know enough Hebrew. What's Bar? Simon Bar Jonah? Son. And what's Abba? So Jesus went to the cross where another man, who's called Son of the Father, usurped his position. And when Jesus comes again, who is he coming to overthrow? A man who comes and calls himself Son of the Father. Just an FYI. Okay. But you see this Simon Bar-Jonah, right? Husbands or sons' names. Matthew 20:20, this mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus as an example. Place of origin. Which Jesus? Jesus of Nazareth. That Jesus. Simon of Cyrene. Oh, that Simon. Okay? Or occupation. Simon the leper, Simon the zealot, Simon the tanner. What's interesting, though, is when you get into less common names, these ideas of disambiguation, they don't even show up. Nathaniel, son of, we don't know, right? Or Bartholomew. All you had to do is say Bartholomew, you know. It's like Cher. There's only one. You're not going to, Oprah. Yeah. We don't need a last name. We know who you're talking about. So, Cleopas, James the Little, or Jairus. There's an uncommon name. And when they came to the official Jairus, you don't have to disambiguate. I can find the Jairus. The official Jairus, that's pretty easy to narrow down. So this is what we see over and over again. In the apocryphal Gospels, in those lost books of the Bible, quote unquote, what you find is they don't do this kind of stuff. They'll talk about Didymus Judas Thomas or James the Just, Simon Peter, but they'll say just Jesus or Matthew or Thomas or Mary or Salome, like everybody's supposed to know which one it is. See, in the gospel accounts, that disambiguation shows that it's people who understood the times, who lived in it, who would never refer to Simon as just Simon. They would be Simon Peter or Simon Bar-Jonah, something like that. But the Gospel of Mary just says the Savior, Peter, Mary, Andrew, Levi. No disambiguations, no patronymic inscriptions. This is 150, 200 years later, and they're writing, well outside Palestine. They have no idea that you have to make a distinction. That's what forgeries look like. The Gospel of Judas does the same thing. And it has names like Barbello or Sophia or Nebro or Yaldabaoth and Sakla, Seth, Harmonagoth, Galilea, Yodel, all these names that are just nowhere close to being popular in Israel at that time. So is the Gospel of Judas a forgery? Of course it is. It shows its false status in myriads of ways, one of which is the fact that it can't get the names right. Again, there's no logical connection between names and people, but these names and their frequency, to me, imply a very high quality level of testimony. If I was a judge or a jury examining evidence, and this evidence was put before me, I would say, that sounds like it's eyewitness testimony. It doesn't sound made up. And Bauckham, again, says that. He says the names of Palestinian Jews in the Gospel and Acts coincide very closely with the names of the general population of Jewish Palestine in this period, but not the names of the Jews in the diaspora. In this light, it becomes very unlikely that those in the Gospels are late accreditations to true traditions. In other words, they weren't made up and added later. So if the Gospels can correctly get the details of the hardest stuff, like names, to remember, wouldn't it follow that it would get the easier stuff right? Like when my master I followed for 3 years died, how he died, and whether he rose again.
Thanks for joining me here on the Come Reason podcast. I just wanted to let you know that if you enjoy these shows, you can gain access to a lot of additional content by becoming a Come Reason Defender. With your tax-deductible gift of $25 a month, you'll be able to view exclusive videos, debates, and presentations, even by top scholars such as Dr. J.P. Moreland, Sean McDowell, J. Warner Wallace, Dr. Hugh Ross, and many, many more. Plus, our Defenders Library provides PowerPoint presentations and notes used to develop these podcasts. So check it out by logging on to the comereason.org/defenders page on the website and see all the benefits your support provides. And thank you for supporting Come Reason Ministries.
That's one way that we can understand how the Gospels are reliable. Here's another. When someone is testifying as a witness in a crime, in an accident, something like that, there's a few things that detectives want to ensure. And one is they want to ensure that these people aren't colluding with one another to get their story straight. This is why when an officer arrives at the scene of an accident or a scene of a crime, and there's any witnesses around, what do they first do? Can I talk to you over here? Can I bring you over here? Can we separate the witnesses or the suspects even, into separate rooms? Because we want to make sure they're not listening to one another and trying to align their stories with one another, right? Collusion is suspected when stories match each other in precision, in phrasing, in delivery, and in detail. But eyewitnesses don't usually speak the same way, and they normally see different aspects of the same scene. And so eyewitnesses corroborate stories when one provides a detail that's not included or that's maybe a little different from another. But it helps explain the full scene. Ma'am, can you tell me what happened at the accident? Well, I don't know. I think the red car was going through the intersection and the white car came up from behind and hit him. Then he goes over, sir, can you tell me what happened from the accident? Yeah, the first car was turning, but he turned on a red light and then wanted to hit his brakes, and then the second car came behind and hit him. Okay. Now, when they put those two stories together and they look, if the red car is the first car and the white car is the second car, then you can kind of, okay, I'm starting to piece things together, but these two folks have different versions of the accounts because they saw it in different ways. One saw the light, one saw the color of the cars, and together we can kind of composite the story. Well, that's what we can do with the gospel accounts as well. This idea of undesigned coincidences first came out in a book by this gentleman, John James Blunt, and it is actually, you can download it for free because it's out of copyright on the internet, 1869, and he writes, an undesigned coincidence occurs when one account of an event leaves out a bit of information that doesn't affect the overall picture, but a different account indirectly supplies the missing detail, usually answering some natural question raised by the first. Now, forgers, they don't want to leave loose ends. They don't want to leave statements that might raise awkward questions. So they take care to tie everything together neatly, but these are just the sort of things we would expect to find in authentic and at least partly independent records of the same real event told by different people. So let me give you an example of this. Matthew 4:18 through 22. Now you're all familiar with this. This is the call of the first disciples. And it says, now as Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, who was called Peter. Oh, notice the disambiguation, right? And Andrew, his brother, again, a brother of Peter, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. And he said to them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Immediately they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James the son of Zebedee and John his brother. Again, disambiguation, these are popular names. In the boat with Zebedee their father, mending their nets, and he called them. Immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Now, when I read this, I've always been struck by this. It's like, It's like Jesus was this magic talisman. Come with me. Like he's using the force, These aren't the fish nets you're looking for. I will make you fishers of men. That kind of thing. And that's kind of how it reads. But notice there's a couple of points of detail in this that we should see. Peter and Andrew were fishing. They immediately left their nets, which is strange. How are they? What's going to happen to those things? What about the boat? What do they do with that? John and James are mending their nets. And they also left the boat and their father. Now, when we read the parallel account in Luke, we find something interesting. Because Luke goes a little earlier in the evening or in the morning. It says, now it happened that while the crowd was pressing around him and listening to the word of God, he was standing by the lake of Gennesaret. And he saw 2 boats lying at the edge of the lake. But the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. And he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little way from the land. And he sat down and began teaching the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into deep water and let down your nets for a catch. Simon answered and said, Master, we worked hard all night and caught nothing. But I will do as you say and let down the nets. So when they had done this, they enclosed a great quantity of fish, and their nets began to break. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat for them to come and help them. And they came and filled both of the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw that, he fell down at Jesus' feet and said, Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. For the amazement had seized him and all of his companions because of the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, Do not fear. From now on you will be catching men. Now when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. Now we've got a little bit more detail. And notice how the story plays out when you put the two together. Jesus gets in Peter's boat. He preaches a sermon. And they were both moved. By the way, Peter and Andrew have partners who were John and James. And their father was the business owner, really, at the time. Okay? They had this huge haul of fish after that. After that sermon, it's like, all right, Lord, you gave a good sermon. I don't know if you know anything about fishing, but we'll give you a try. And they pulled up such a great fish that what? Their nets began to break. What did it say in Matthew that James and John were doing? Mending their nets. Why were they mending their nets? Because Luke tells us the nets were breaking. Matthew doesn't tell us that. He just says that they're mending their nets. What a strange detail to throw in there without explaining it. Why did Peter and Andrew leave their nets and their boats and not worry about it? Because Zebedee's still on the shore. And Luke tells us that they're all in business together. Zebedee can take care of the tackle. Zebedee can take care of the equipment. And why did they immediately leave when Jesus says, come and follow me? Because they just saw this amazing miracle of the fish. That's when they all left and followed him. Dad, you just saw. You're good with the fish. Go cash in. We're going with this guy. It reads more naturally. It makes more sense. And it shows that Luke has details that Matthew doesn't have, and Matthew has details that Luke doesn't have. Do you see how these undesigned coincidences show that both accounts rely on one another for detail, and shows that what we're talking about is testimony, not forgery? Let's look at another one. The healing at evening. Popular one, Matthew 8:14 through 17. When Jesus came into Peter's home, he saw his mother-in-law lying sick in bed with a fever. He touched her hand. The fever left her. She got up and waited on him. Now when evening came, they brought to him many who were demon-possessed, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were ill. This was to fulfill what was spoken, but through Isaiah the prophet. He himself took our infirmities and carried away our diseases. Now, We just read in the first account that the crowds kept pressing into Jesus so much that he had to sail out in a boat. Jesus comes into Peter's home, and there are no crowds until evening comes. That's weird. Why aren't they crowding over him there? Well, you have to look at Mark 1:9 or Mark 1:21 in order to understand what's happening. In Mark 1, starting in verse 21, it says, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching. And then Mark 1:29, and immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with fever. So it was the Sabbath day that Jesus taught in the synagogue, left the synagogue, healed Peter's mother-in-law. Then when evening comes, guess what? If you're a pious practicing Jew, Ollie Oxenfree, I get to come out now and bring my sick relatives to Jesus to be healed. But you don't read about that in Matthew. You need Mark in order to put the two pieces together. Now it makes sense. Now you've got a discussion. Now you've got an explanation for what's going on. Let's try one more. The feeding of the 5,000. Now this is an interesting miracle because it is recounted in all four of the Gospels, so we have a lot that we can compare against. In Matthew 14:19, it talks about the grass that the crowd sat on, right? Jesus wants them to all sit down. And on Matthew 14:19, it says grass. In Mark 6:39, it says green grass. In John 6:10, it says much grass. So it was very fruitful. This was probably after the spring rains, right? If you've ever been to Israel, how many of you have been to Israel? Okay, if you've ever been to Israel, it is very eerily similar to the weather here in Southern California. Very, matter of fact, freakishly similar. I mean, we're on the road going, up from the Dead Sea, and I'm like, I'm ready to see Hemet at any point here because the only way you can really tell the difference is the fact that there's a few more rocks, and they all have their water heaters on their roofs, so they use solar water heater. But the coastal regions are very much like Newport and these coasts. The inland regions are very much like our inland regions. So it's dry most of the time. You don't get a lot of green hills unless you have those spring rains. But notice, John says much grass, Mark says green grass, and Matthew says grass. There was grass. All three of them agree. Now, that's not a big detail. That's not something that was necessary. Again, if you were traveling through Israel, most of the time you would sit on the dirt. For most of the year, it would be dirt. Just like the hills here, it would be dirt. But they all agree that it's grass. And then in John, when Jesus says, hey, is there anyone here who has food? What does John say? There's a boy here, John 6:9, who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Oh. What does that have to do with anything? Guess what is the very first crop to be harvested? The only crop to be harvested in the spring? Barley. Barley was considered the least valuable or the least desirable type of grain in order to make bread from. They liked wheat and other grains, but those wouldn't come into their full until August, September, October, where you have the feast of, Rosh Hashanah and all that stuff. But barley grows up in the spring. So John has barley loaves with this kid, which wouldn't be a first choice, at the right time during the spring when the spring rains are coming in. That's pretty cool. That's amazing. Also during this time, Jesus gives Philip a little pop quiz. And Jesus, when he crossed that Sea of Galilee in John 6, it says he all went to a deserted place. Matthew, Mark, Luke, right? Luke says they withdrew privately to a town called Bethsaida. And in John 6, it reads, now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. Again, we're talking spring, Passover time. Therefore, Jesus, lifting up his eyes and seeing that a large crowd was coming to him, oh boy, here comes all these people, said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that they may eat? Now, if you've ever read the Gospels, you're like, Philip never gets asked any questions. I mean, he's a decent kid, but, he's not ever the guy. Why is Jesus asking Philip questions? But he says to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these may eat? He was saying to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Well, John chapter 1 answers that question. Philip was from Bethsaida, the hometown of Andrew and Peter. So Philip was a hometown boy. And Jesus wanted to see how Philip would react if we're close to his stomping grounds. Would he know it? And in Mark 6, what second comment happened was the crowds were gathering, and what happened was Peter and Andrew got nervous. And Mark said, but many saw them leaving and recognized them. Now, why would many recognize them? Well, we know from John 1. Because Bethsaida was also the hometown of Andrew and Peter. So if they were all hometown boys, it explains in Mark why they would have, I know these guys. I used to go to school with them. That makes sense, right? So Mark explains that they were recognized, but not why they were recognized. John explains that they were from the hometown, but not that they were recognized. But you put the two together again, and what you have is a complete tale, something that makes sense, something that reads naturally as well. It reads humanly. It reads like testimony. And that's what we want to take away. You look at the names, the naming conventions, how those fell together. You look at these undesigned coincidences. And I just gave you a taste. There are tons of these in the New Testament as you explore them. And that book by John James Blunt is a great place to start. But when you look at all of them together, thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.